In a future carved from frost and forged by code, one princess born of glacial perfection carries a curse that freezes all who come too close, until a human scientist impervious to her touch unlocks the anomaly. But what begins as genetic study spirals into a rebellion against an empire obsessed with artificial evolution. Their love isn't just forbidden, it's disruptive. And in a palace of ice, one kiss might fracture a legacy built on centuries of control. Her lips froze anyone that kissed her, except the human. The kiss lasted only a second before the young diplomat's lips turned blue, fractal frost spreading across his face in delicate patterns. His eyes widened in shock, then glazed over as the glacial shell encased him completely. Another statue for the garden, another reminder of why Princess Selene remained alone. She stepped back from the glaciated figure, her 8-foot frame casting a long shadow across the marble floor. The cryocore at her throat pulsed with a soft blue light, matching the rhythm of her rapid heartbeat. Around her, the assembled court whispered behind raised hands, their pale blue skin almost white under the glacial chandeliers. "Your Highness!" Primarch Virex's voice cut through the murmurs. "Perhaps we should adjourn until the effects wear off." Of course, Selene's voice carried the chill of her touch, though not by choice. She watched as servants carefully moved the glaciated diplomat to the palace gardens, where he would thaw over the next few hours, embarrassed but unharmed. The great doors of the throne of Iceborne Spire's audience chamber swung open, interrupting the exodus of courtiers. Ambassador James Saren strode in his human complexion, ruddy against the ice-pale surroundings. Behind him walked a younger man, who immediately caught Selene's attention. Your Highness Saren bowed with practiced grace. "May I present Dr. Orion Kale, the xenobiologist." I mentioned in my correspondence. Orion stepped forward and bowed. His dark hair fell slightly across his forehead as he straightened, and Selene noticed his eyes warm brown, studying her with scientific interest rather than fear or artificial desire. Princess Selene, his voice carried none of the usual tremor first-time visitors displayed. "Thank you for allowing me to conduct my research here, Dr. Orion Kyle." She inclined her head, white hair flowing like silk. "I trust Envoy Saren explained the unique challenges of studying our biology." He did. Orion's gaze flickered to the fractal frost pattern, still marking the floor where the diplomat had stood. "Though I admit seeing it firsthand is remarkable." Virex cleared his throat. "Your Highness, given today's events, perhaps we should postpone." "No." Selene's tone left no room for argument. "The Luminary Alliance approved this research. Dr. Orion Kale will begin immediately." She extended her hand to test as much as a greeting. The court held its collective breath as Orion stepped forward without hesitation. His fingers clasped hers. Nothing happened. No fractal frost, no spreading ice. Just the strange warmth of human skin against her perpetually cold touch. Orion's eyes widened slightly, but his grip remained steady. "Fascinating. The biochemical reaction appears to be selective." "How are you?" Selene stopped herself, aware of the many eyes watching. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in the laboratory." "Of course, Your Highness." As they walked from the chamber, Selene felt Virex's disapproving gaze on her back. She also felt something else, something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope in the corridor. Orion matched her long strides easily. "I have several theories about the mechanism behind your ability. With your permission, I'd like to begin with a basic genetic analysis. You're not afraid of being glaciated." He glanced at her with unexpected humor in his eyes. "I think we've established that's not a concern, unless you have other deadly abilities I should know about." For the first time in recent memory, Selene felt her lips curve into a genuine smile. "Not deadly, though there are many things about my people you might find surprising. I look forward to discovering them all." His voice carried a note that made her cryocore diadem pulse faster, though she told herself it was merely scientific enthusiasm. She had no way of knowing that this human would indeed discover all her secrets and change her world forever. The royal laboratory gleamed with glacial technology surfaces covered in intricate fractal frost patterns that served as both decoration and complex computational systems. Orion adjusted his microscope, watching as Selene's genetic essence sample shifted and flowed with unusual properties. "Your cellular structure is extraordinary. he murmured, making notes on his tablet the way your genetic essence crystals form and dissolve. Is that why you're immune? Celine stood closer than protocol strictly allowed, her tall frame casting cool shadows over his workspace. The cryocore at her throat pulsed steadily. No. Orion straightened, aware of her proximity. Human genetic essence has anti-glaciate proteins, but that's not enough to explain this level of resistance. There's something else. He reached for another slide, his hand brushing against hers. The contact sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with cold. You should be more careful, Dr. Orion Kale. Her voice carried a hint of concern. Just because you're immune doesn't mean you should be reckless. Orion, he corrected, meeting her bright blue eyes. If we're going to work this closely, you might as well use my name. A small smile played at her lips. Orion, the way she said it, made his heart rate spike. Then you should call me Celine, when we're alone at least. The laboratory door hissed open. Primarch Virex entered his white robes, swishing against the floor. Your Highness, I trust the research progresses satisfactorily. It does. Celine stepped back, resuming her royal bearing. Dr. Orion Coyle's insights are invaluable. Indeed. Virex's gaze lingered on the minimal space between them. The Council is most interested in his findings, particularly regarding his unusual immunity. Orion saved his data and stood. I'd be happy to prepare a preliminary report. That won't be necessary. Virex smiled thinly. Just continue your work though, perhaps with more professional distance. After he left, tension hung in the air like fractal frost. Orion returned to his microscope, but his focus had shifted to the way Celine's breathing had quickened during their close contact. Your advisor seems concerned about our research. Virex is concerned about everything. Celine moved to the window, staring out at the glaciated gardens below, especially anything that might disrupt the careful order he's helped maintain. Orion joined her at the window. In the garden, he spotted the thawed diplomat from earlier, hurrying toward a shuttle, clearly eager to leave the moon's glaciated surface. Is that why you agreed to this study? To disrupt the order. Celine turned to him, her height bringing them nearly eye to eye. I agreed because I'm tired of being alone. The confession hung between them. Orion reached up, fingers hovering near the cryocore at her throat. This jewelry, it's more than decoration, isn't it? Everything in the palace is more than it appears. She caught his hand before it could touch the diadem, including me. Their fingers intertwined. Orion felt her pulse through her cool skin, rapid and strong. He stepped closer. Your Highness, a servant's voice carried through the door. The Council requests your presence. Celine released his hand slowly. We'll continue tomorrow. I'll be here. Orion watched her go, mind racing with questions about the diadem, her powers, and the way she affected him. In the shadows outside the laboratory, a figure with a scarred face observed the scene through the fractal frost-etched windows. Marshal Rendak smiled, noting how the princess's cryocore flickered erratically in the human's presence. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Steam rose from the heated pool, a rare sight in the palace's private gardens. Orion sat at its edge, analyzing data on his tablet while waiting for Celine. The warmth was necessary for the next phase of tests, though he admitted the setting felt more intimate than scientific. Enjoying our only heated space. Celine's voice carried a touch of amusement. She emerged from behind a glacial pillar, wearing a form-fitting suit designed for aquatic research. Orion stood trying to maintain professional composure. The suit highlighted her tall, elegant frame, and the cryocore at her throat seemed to pulse more rapidly. The thermal differential should help isolate the variables in your body's freezing response. His voice remained steady, even as she gracefully entered the pool. Always the scientist, she submerged to her shoulders, white hair floating around her like fractal frost. Even in moments like this, not always. Orion shed his outer coat, revealing the similar suit beneath. He slipped into the water, the heat, a sharp contrast to the cold air above. Sometimes, I'm just a man trying to understand an extraordinary woman. Careful, her blue eyes darkened. That sounds dangerously like flirting. Would that be so terrible? Before she could answer, he reached for her hand beneath the water. Their fingers intertwined, and Orion felt the familiar cool touch of her skin fighting against the pool's warmth. Your core temperature barely rises, he noted. Professional interest warring with personal desire, even in these conditions. Is that all you notice? Valka moved closer. water rippling around them. Orion's other hand rose to her face, tracing the elegant line of her jaw. "I notice everything about you." The cryocore flared brilliantly as their lips met. Orion felt the initial surge of cold, then nothing but the sweet pressure of her mouth against his. Valka gasped into the kiss, clearly unused to such prolonged, intimate contact. When they parted, her eyes were wide with wonder. What was fascinating? Orion smiled, still holding her close. "I was going to say, incredible." Her fingers traced his unfrozen lips. "I've never been able to." A sharp crack echoed through the garden. They turned to see Envoy Saren standing at the entrance, an apologetic expression on his face. "I hate to interrupt, but we have a situation." Saren's usual diplomatic Polish seemed strained. "Orion, a word." Reluctantly, Orion pulled himself from the pool. Saren watched as he quickly dried off and followed Saren into a secluded alcove. "Are you insane?" Saren kept his voice low. "Do you know what Virex would do if he saw that I'm conducting authorized research? That didn't look like research." Saren ran a hand through his gray hair. "Listen to me, carefully. There are things about this place, about her family, that you don't understand. Forces that would kill to maintain the status quo. What aren't you telling me? Be careful." Saren glanced at the pool where Selene remained. Some mysteries should stay glaciated. After Saren left, Orion returned to find Selene already emerging from the pool. Frost patterns decorated her suit where water droplets had glaciated. "Bad news?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. "Nothing that changes anything." He helped her with a warming cloth, though I am curious about what Saren fears. "Everyone here fears something." Selene's hand rose to her diadem. "The question is, what will we do about it?" In the shadows of a high window, Primarch Virex observed their interaction with cold calculation. He spoke quietly into a communication device. "Initiate the isolation protocol. The human has become a liability." Orion's laboratory access card wouldn't work. He tried again, frowning at the denial message flashing across the fractal frost-etched screen. Behind him, the palace corridors seemed emptier than usual, the normal flow of servants and courtiers conspicuously absent. His tablet chimed with an incoming analysis result. The genetic essence sample he'd been studying showed something impossible. Artificial molecular structures integrated with Selene's natural cells. Before he could investigate further, the tablet screen froze and went dark, looking for something specific. "Dr. Orion Kale." Orion turned to find Marshal Rendak emerging from an alcove, the scarred side of his face catching the glacial light. His dark armor absorbed the palace's ambient glow. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows what you've just discovered." Rendak gestured to the dead tablet. "About the princess's condition, about what they've done to the royal family." A distant scream echoed through the corridors. Orion's pulse quickened. "Selene, 3rd floor, East Wing." Rendak produced a security card. "They're adjusting her diadem settings. You have minutes before the changes become permanent." Orion grabbed the card, but didn't move. "Why help me? Because some of us remember what our people were before." Virex's improvements, Rendak's remaining eye narrowed. "Now, run." Orion sprinted through the palace using the card to access restricted lifts and passages. He found the East Wing guarded by glaciated servants, victims of what appeared to be an uncontrolled burst of Selene's power. Through a fractal frost-covered door, he heard her voice. "Please stop." The settings were too low. Virex's voice carried through the ice. "The human made you weak, made you forget your purpose." Orion slammed the security card into the door's reader. Inside, he found Selene on her knees, the cryocore at her throat blazing with painful intensity. Virex stood over her, manipulating a glacial control panel. Step away from her, Orion moved forward, but invisible force fields sparked between him and them. Dr. Orion Kale Virex didn't look up from his work. Here to witness the culmination of generations of genetic engineering, we made the royal family living weapons. Did you think that power came naturally? Selene's skin had begun to crystallize, spreading from the diadem. Orion, the cryocore. It's not just control, it's phase convergence, the final stage. Virex nodded, pure glacial in form. No more messy emotions, no more weakness, just pure, perfect power. You're turning her into a weapon. Orion's mind raced through everything he'd learned about their biology. The diadem isn't suppressing her power, it's artificially enhancing it. For generations, Virex's smile was cruel, each ruler more powerful than the last, each one further from our primitive feeling. Ancestors Orion spotted a familiar pattern in the force field matrix, the same pattern he'd noted in Selene's cellular structure, a pattern that his human biology somehow disrupted. He charged forward. The force field crackled but shattered against his touch, just like Selene's cryogenic touch couldn't affect him. Virex's eyes widened in genuine surprise. That's not possible. I'm getting tired of hearing that. Orion tackled the advisor away from the controls. They crashed into the glacial panel, shattering its delicate surface. The cryo core at Selena's throat pulsed erratically. She gasped as the crystallization receded, leaving her trembling but intact. Guards Virex shouted, "Contain them." But the only response was a slow clap from the doorway. Rendak stepped through, flanked by palace security, wearing his insignia. I think he said, "It's time we had a long overdue conversation about the true history of our people." Selene stood shakily, her hand, finding Orion's nothing, with why a human's touch breaks all your careful genetic programming. Virex's face contorted with rage as guards surrounded him. Outside the windows, dawn broke over the glaciated moon, casting rainbow patterns through the ice that seemed somehow less rigid, less perfect than before. The Royal Archive Chamber felt more like a tomb than a library. Orion studied ancient genetic records displayed on glacial screens, while Selene paced her fingers, constantly straying to the cryocore at her throat. Over 50 bloodline iterations, her voice carried equal parts wonder and horror. They've been modifying our bloodline for 17 generations. The original genetic markers are still there. Orion gestured to a complex molecular diagram, buried under layers of manipulation, but present. Your natural abilities were never meant to be this strong or this uncontrollable. She stopped beside him, close enough that her cool aura raised goosebumps on his skin. Is that why you're immune? Because you're natural? Partially. He pulled up another diagram. Human genocode has unique properties. We adapt. Survive in extreme conditions. Something in my genetic structure actively disrupts the artificial enhancements in yours, like an antidote to poison, like a key to a lock. He turned to her, reaching for the cryocore. This time, she didn't stop him. The gem felt warm under his fingers, pulsing with strange energy. This isn't just controlling your power, it's actively changing you. Trying to complete the phase convergence, Virex started. A throat cleared behind them. Envoy, Saren stood in the doorway, looking grave. That phase convergence has been the goal all along. You knew Orion's hand dropped from the diadem. Not everything. Saren entered, closing the door. Not enough. The Luminary Alliance has suspected genetic manipulation for years, but we could never prove it. That's why I pushed for your research assignment. You used me. Orion's voice hardened. I gave you an opportunity to help her. Saren's eyes fixed on Selene, to help all of them. Why now? Selene's tone could have glaciated flame. Why after so many generations? Because of him. Saren nodded to Orion. We never had proof that the programming could be disrupted until you. The archive door burst open. Rendak entered with 2 guards, his scarred face tight with urgency. Virex's escaped custody. Orion moved protectively closer to Selene. Help from inside the council. Half the noble houses support his vision of glacial evolution. Rendak's remaining eye narrowed. They're calling for the princess's immediate phase convergence to preserve the bloodline's purity. Like hell, Orion's hand found Selene's, their fingers intertwining. The touch sent unexpected electricity through them both. The cryocore flared, and for a moment, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. But instead of pulling away, Orion drew her closer. I can't control it. Her voice shook. The diadem. It's getting stronger. Then don't control it. His other hand cupped her face. Let it out, all of it. Their lips met in a desperate kiss. The cryocore blazed like a star, fractal frost spreading across every surface in the archive. Selene and Rendak stepped back as the temperature plummeted, but where the fractal frost touched Orion, it melted. Where glacial tried to form, it reverted to liquid. Their kiss deepened, and Selene felt something inside her, shifting, changing. The cryocore's light suddenly dimmed. Selene broke the kiss with a gasp as new sensations flooded her. I can feel everything, the cold, the warmth, you. The artificial programming. Saren breathed. He's neutralizing it. A distant explosion rocked the palace. Alarms began blaring through the glacial corridors. Vayrex Rendak drew a weapon. He's making his move. Let him come. Selene straightened to her full height, power radiating from her in controlled waves. Her eyes met Orion's with newfound clarity. I'm done being their perfect weapon. In the corridor outside, footsteps approached, many footsteps. Saren drew a hidden blaster, while Orion's hand tightened around Selene's. The real war for the glaciated moon's future was about to begin. The palace halls had become a war zone. Frozen figures lined the corridors, some Vayrex supporters, others loyal palace guards. Orion and Selene ran past them all, her hand cold but steady in his as they navigated the chaos. The main reactor chamber, Rendak called from behind them, covering their retreat. It's where they'll try to complete the phase convergence. The cold fusion core provides enough power to force the change. Another explosion rocked the palace. Through glacial windows, Orion saw ships emerging from beneath the glaciated moon's surface, hidden forces loyal to Vayrex's vision of evolution. Saren Orion glanced back at the ambassador, who was typing furiously into a communication device. Luminari Alliance forces are responding, but they won't arrive in time. Saren's face was grim. We're on our own. They reached a sealed doorway. Selene pressed her hand to the fractal frost-covered panel, but nothing happened. The cryocore at her throat pulsed erratically. They've locked me out of my own palace. Her voice carried equal parts fury and fear. Orion studied the door's glacial structure, the same artificial patterns like your enhanced genocode. He placed his hand over hers on the panel. Together the fractal frost patterns shifted, responding to their combined touch. The door slid open with a crack of breaking ice. Inside the reactor chamber, sprawled like a glaciated cathedral, a massive column of blue-white energy rose from the center, feeding power throughout the palace. Around its base, dozens of noble houses had gathered, their ceremonial armor gleaming. Vayrex stood on a raised platform, his white robes now featuring glacial growths that seemed to be spreading across his skin. Welcome, Your Highness, to your ascension. This ends now. Selene's voice echoed through the chamber. The cryocore blazed as her power rolled out in waves, but Vayrex merely smiled. You still don't understand? This was always the plan. From the moment we detected human genetic signatures that could disrupt our programming, he gestured to Orion. We needed to prove it could be done to show the final stage was possible. You wanted me to break your control. Orion's mind raced. Why? Because now we can overcome it. Vayrex raised his hands. The reactor's energy surged, and every cryocore in the chamber, worn by all the noble houses, began to pulse in unison. Evolution requires resistance to grow stronger. Selene cried out as her diadem flared with burning light. Orion caught her as she stumbled, feeling ice spread from her skin to his. Your human genocode provides the key. Vayrex's body was crystallizing rapidly now. Once we understand how to overcome it, nothing will stop our phase convergence. We will become perfect. Perfect. Selene straightened in Orion's arms, fighting the power, trying to change her. You mean cold, empty, dead inside? She turned to the assembled nobles. Is that what you want? To lose everything that makes us alive? Life is weakness. Vayrex's voice reverberated increasingly. Inhuman feeling is weakness. Orion pulled Selene closer, even as fractal frost crept up his arms. This is strength. Their lips met in a desperate kiss. The cryocore's light stuttered, caught between Vayrex's influence and Orion's disruptive presence. Around them, noble houses watched in growing uncertainty as their own transformations wavered. Stop them. Vayrex's command cracked like breaking ice. But Rendak and Saren had been busy. The reactor's power suddenly fluctuated as planted charges detonated around its base. The harmonized pulse of the cryocores faltered. Selene broke the kiss with a gasp. The diadem helped me remove it. Orion's fingers found the clasp, fighting through layers of ice. The cryocore's light blazed desperately as Vayrex howled in rage. The fate of two civilizations balanced on the edge of phase convergence. And in that glacial chamber, surrounded by the forces of cold perfection, a very human warmth began to spread. Ice crackled around Orion's fingers as he struggled with the diadem's clasp. Each touch sent shocks of cold through his body, his immunity fighting against the concentrated power. Selene trembled in his arms, caught between phase convergence and freedom. Even if you remove it, Vyrex's glacial voice echoed through the chamber. The changes are already in her genetic essence. In all our genetic essence, the reactor's damaged core pulsed erratically, sending waves of energy through the assembled nobles. Some began to crystallize their sapphires, forcing the phase convergence. Others fought it, inspired by Selene's resistance. My genetic essence. Orion's fingers numbed, but didn't stop working at the clasp. That's what this was always about, wasn't it? Not just testing genetic disruptor anomaly, but harvesting it. Vyrex's largely glacial form shifted fragments of his original face, showing through like a broken mask. Human adaptability, the final component we needed. Once we understand how to overcome it, the phase convergence will be irreversible. You're planning to infect humanity. Saren raised his blaster, but ice encased it instantly. Turn both species into your glacial abomination. Evolution. Vyrex corrected, pure, perfect, eternal. The diadem's clasp finally gave way under Orion's fingers. As he pulled it free, Selene cried out. Not in pain, but shock. Power surged from her in a devastating wave. Ice exploded outward, coating every surface. Noble houses scattered as their own transformations went haywire. Flares pulsing out of sync. The reactor core fluctuated wildly. What have you done? Vyrex's voice cracked like breaking glass. Without the diadem, her power is unstable. No. Selene stood tall, her skin rippling with waves of fractal frost. For the first time, I am in control. She reached for Orion, who took her hand without hesitation. Where their skin met, the fractal frost patterns changed, becoming organic, flowing, natural, possible. Vyrex raised his glacial arms. The reactor core flared blindingly bright. I won't let you ruin centuries of progress. Energy arcs from the core channeling through Vyrex into every cryo-core in the chamber. Those nobles still loyal to him screamed as their transformations accelerated. Those who had hesitated ripped their jewels off following Selene's example. The core's going critical. Rendak shouted over the chaos. The whole facility could collapse. Get everyone out. Saren helped stun nobles toward the exit. Luminari Alliance ships are entering orbit. But Orion and Selene stood their ground, hands clasped as power surged around them. Where their fingers intertwined, fractal frost met warmth in swirling patterns. I can feel it, Selene whispered. The original genetic code fighting back against the artificial changes. Then let it. Orion pulled her close, uncaring of the ice spreading up his arms. Show them what real evolution looks like. Their lips met as the reactor reached critical mass. Selene's natural power, no longer contained by the diadem, poured through her. But instead of freezing Orion, it resonated with his human genocode, creating something entirely new. The kiss deepened as waves of transformative energy washed over them. Behind them, Vyrex howled in fury and despair as his perfect glacial future began to crack. Space between cold and warm, between natural and artificial, between human and alien. A new future was taking form, and at its heart stood a princess and a doctor, proving that the greatest evolution of all was the power to choose love over perfection. The reactor chamber shook violently as energy cascaded through its glacial architecture. Where Orion and Selene's combined power touched the walls, fractal frost patterns shifted from rigid geometric shapes to flowing organic swirls. The artificial programming is breaking down, Orion observed, watching the phase convergence spread, not just in you, but in the entire palace infrastructure. Selene's hand tightened in his as another wave of power surged through her. Because none of this was natural, the palace, the power system, even our biology, all of it was forced into perfect glacial patterns. No, Vyrex's largely transformed body shuddered as cracks appeared in his glacial surface. We sacrificed everything for this evolution, centuries of work. The remaining loyal nobles found their own transformations, failing sapphires dulling as the artificial resonance collapsed. Those who had removed their jewels watched in wonder as their natural abilities reasserted themselves, weaker but controllable. We wanted evolution. Selene stepped forward, pulling Orion with her watch closely. Where their joined hands touched the reactor's energy field, the artificial patterns unraveled. Natural ice crystals formed and flowed, beautiful in their imperfection. The cold fusion core's light shifted from harsh blue-white to a softer, more organic aurora. Luminari Alliance ships are docking, Saren called from the doorway, medical teams standing by. But Virex wasn't finished with a sound like shattering glass. He lunged at Orion. "If I can't have perfection, I'll take your precious human genocode to the grave." Orion moved to defend himself, but Selene was faster. A wave of her power caught Virex mid-leap, encasing him in a cocoon of ice. But this ice was different, natural, allowing them to see his glacial form already beginning to thaw. "Your choice." Primarch Virex. Selene's voice carried authority without cruelty. "Find who you were or remain forever trapped between transformations. The programming is breaking down in his cells too." Orion noted, scanning with his tablet. "All of you should stabilize into your natural states within hours." Around them, the palace continued to transform. The rigid artificial architecture softened into more organic shapes. Ice formations that had been static for generations began to flow and change. Various approached his scarred face, reflecting the aurora like light. The noble houses are standing down. Most have already removed their sapphires, and the ones who didn't. Selene asked, "They will need help reversing their partial transformations." Orion squeezed her hand. "But between Luminari Alliance medical science and your natural abilities, we can guide them back." Back to weakness? Virex's voice was barely recognizable through the ice. "Back to life." Selene turned to the assembled crowd. "We became so obsessed with perfect power that we forgot what power was for, to protect, to connect, to love." The last words sent a pulse through her body that resonated with Orion's touch. Where their skin met, fractal frost and warmth danced in harmony. Speaking of connection, Orion drew her closer, uncaring of their audience. "I believe we were conducting an experiment on natural responses." Selene's smile carried all the warmth her kind had denied themselves for generations. A very thorough experiment. Their lips met as the reactor chamber continued its phase convergence around them. This kiss held no fear, no hesitation, only the pure joy of two beings choosing each other over artificial perfection. In his icy prison, Virex watched as centuries of genetic manipulation dissolved in the face of something his perfect programming had never accounted for. Natural selection had chosen love. Luminari Alliance medical ships hovered above the palace like mechanical stars, their lights casting rainbow patterns through the transforming glacial spires. In the royal chambers, Orion analyzed data from the latest scans of Selene's genetic essence. The artificial structures are almost completely broken down. He reported, watching natural ice patterns dance across her skin. "Your core temperature is stabilizing at your species' true baseline." In my powers, Selene stood by the window, her 8-foot frame silhouetted against the aurora-filled sky. Reduced but natural, controllable, he moved behind her hand, sliding around her waist. No more accidental freezing. She turned in his embrace, blue eyes meeting brown. "Are you disappointed? Now that I'm not your perfect research subject." "Perfect is boring." His fingers traced the pale skin where the diadem had been. "I prefer you wild and unpredictable." Her lips met and the temperature dropped, but only slightly. A pleasant cool breeze rather than a killing fractal frost. When they parted, Selene's smile held a predatory edge. "How unpredictable would you like?" Before Orion could respond, Saren cleared his throat from the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation with Virex." In the medical bay, Virex's partially glacial form lay strapped to a bed. The artificial phase convergence was slowly reversing, leaving him caught between states. "The process is killing him." A Luminary Alliance doctor reported, "His cellular structure can't handle the regression. There's a way to save him." Orion studied the readings, but he won't like it. "Human genetic essence?" Virex's voice cracked like thin ice. "Your immunity could stabilize the reversal." "A direct transfusion," Orion nodded. "My genocode would help your cells remember their original pattern." "You would help me?" Virex's remaining organic eye focused on them. "After everything. That's the difference between your perfect evolution and our messy reality." Selene took Orion's hand. "We help each other, even our enemies. How disgustingly organic of you." But Virex's tone held more resignation than venom. As Orion prepared for the procedure, Rendak entered with news from the palace grounds. The noble houses have all surrendered their sapphires. The Luminari Alliance is containing the artifacts for study. And the people? Selene asked, adapting. Many are already showing signs of their natural abilities returning. He smiled slightly. They're calling it the epoch of emergence. The transfusion began. Where Orion's genetic essence entered Virex's system, the glacial structures began to soften and revert. The former advisor shuddered. "I can feel everything." His voice held wonder and horror in equal measure. That's called being alive. Orion monitored the process carefully. "You'll get used to it." Later in Selene's private gardens, they walked among ice formations that now flowed and changed like liquid art. The rigid perfection of the past was gone, replaced by natural beauty. The Luminary Alliance Council is impressed with how you handled the crisis. Saren mentioned joining them. They're suggesting a permanent diplomatic posting here for both of you. Orion looked at Selene, who pulled him close. "I think we could find ways to maintain positive relations between our species." "Very positive relations," Orion agreed, his hands sliding up her back. "I'll take that as a yes." Saren retreated tactfully. "I'll handle the paperwork." Alone in the garden surrounded by living ice that reflected their joined powers, Selene and Orion created their own definition of perfection. One that celebrated the beauty of natural connection over artificial control. And if the temperature dropped dramatically as their kiss deepened, well, that was perfectly natural too. 1 month after the epic of emergence, the Crystal and Palace hosted a very different kind of gathering. The rigid formality of the past was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of genuine celebration. Ice sculptures flowed and changed naturally, reflecting the evolved state of their creators. In the grand hall, Orion adjusted his Luminary Alliance diplomatic uniform while watching Selene address her people. She wore no cryocore diadem, no artificial enhancements, only her natural grace and power. For generations we pursued perfection at the cost of our souls. Her voice carried easily through the space. We forgot that true strength lies not in control, but in connection. Among the crowd, Virex stood with other recovering nobles. His formerly glacial form had reverted to natural state, though traces of fractal frost still patterned his skin. The experience had left him changed in more ways than one. The Luminary Alliance recognizes the sovereign right of our people to choose their own path. Selene continued, and we choose to embrace our natural evolution, including closer ties with humanity. Her eyes met Orion's across the hall, and the temperature dropped pleasantly. Several guests smiled knowingly. Speaking of closer ties, Saren murmured to Orion, "The Luminary Alliance Council is quite pleased with how this all turned out. They're talking about establishing a permanent research exchange. As long as the research remains strictly voluntary." Rendak added his scarred face had softened somewhat, though he still maintained a protective watch over the proceedings. The time of forced evolution is over. Orion agreed, making his way towards Selene as she concluded her speech. The crowd parted naturally before them. "Doctor," she greeted him formally, though her eyes held wicked promise. "Here to conduct more research always." He took her hand, feeling the pleasant cool of her skin, though my latest hypothesis requires extensive testing. Oh, her free hand traced the collar of his uniform. And what hypothesis is that? That natural chemistry he pulled her closer, uncaring of their audience, is far more interesting than artificial perfection. Their lips met to appreciative applause from the gathered crowd. Ice patterns swirled across the floor in organic waves, beautiful in their unpredictability. Later in the privacy of the royal chambers, Orion and Selene stood on a balcony overlooking the transformed palace grounds. The rigid glacial architecture had given way to flowing forms that caught and reflected the aurora above. Having any regrets, Orion asked, his hands tracing patterns on her cool skin, about choosing an imperfect future. Selene's response was to pull him into a kiss that left fractal frost on his lips and fire in his genetic essence. "Does that feel imperfect to you?" "Not at all." He pressed her against the balcony rail, "though we should probably conduct more trials for science." "For science?" she agreed with a predatory smile. "Though I warn you, these experiments could take years. I look forward to every moment." His hands slid lower. After all, the best research is thorough, and he kissed her neck, very hands-on. The aurora above brightened as their passion intensified. In the gardens below, ice formations flowed and danced in response to their combined energy. Where artificial perfection had once ruled, natural passion now reigned. And if anyone in the palace noticed the dramatic temperature fluctuations coming from the royal chambers that night, they simply smiled and appreciated how far their people had evolved. After all, some phenomena didn't require scientific explanation. Sometimes the most perfect answer was simply love.